The recent wave of Ukrainian strikes carried out by the unmanned systems forces is more than a tactical success story, it is a carefully calibrated political signal embedded in military action. By targeting command posts, GRU special forces deployments, logistics hubs, radar systems, and naval assault assets in occupied Donetsk and Crimea, Kyiv is not merely degrading Russian combat capabilities. It is reshaping the strategic narrative at a moment when diplomacy, rather than firepower alone, is increasingly central to the war's trajectory. The choice of targets reveals a deliberate logic. Command posts and GRU special forces sites represent the nervous system of Russian operations in occupied territories. Destroying or disrupting them undermines coordination, intelligence flow, and morale. The Nebo radar systems, repeatedly struck in Crimea and elsewhere, are emblematic of Russia's layered air defense architecture, systems designed to project an image of strategic depth and technological superiority. Their vulnerability to Ukrainian unmanned strikes punctures that image and exposes a structural weakness: Russia's difficulty in defending vast occupied spaces against relatively low-cost, high-precision systems. Meanwhile, the destruction of storage, repair facilities, and fast assault boat deployment sites speaks to a broader effort to erode Russia's operational endurance, not just its frontline firepower. These strikes occur against the backdrop of Ukraine's expanding long-range capabilities, which increasingly blur the line between the front and the rear. Attacks on oil depots, refineries, and defense industrial targets inside Russia proper, such as those in Krasnodar Krai and Ryazan, extend this logic beyond occupied territories. The message is consistent: Russia's war effort is vulnerable across its entire depth, economically as well as militarily. This directly challenges Moscow's assumption that time, attrition, and industrial scale will eventually favor it. Crucially, these battlefield developments intersect with an intensifying diplomatic phase. As peace plans circulate and negotiations, formal and informal, gain momentum, Ukraine's military actions serve to shape the negotiating environment. By demonstrating sustained offensive capability, Kyiv seeks to avoid entering talks from a position of perceived weakness. The strikes reinforce the argument that Ukraine is not simply holding on with Western support, but actively imposing costs on Russia's military infrastructure. In strategic terms, this is about leverage, convincing both adversaries and partners that Ukraine remains a decisive actor whose consent cannot be sidelined in any settlement. Russia's insistence that President Zelensky's 20-point peace plan radically differs from the version discussed with the United States underscores a growing disconnect between battlefield realities and diplomatic ambitions. While Russia seeks to negotiate limits on Ukraine's armed forces and secure relief from sanctions, the continued degradation of its military assets in occupied territories weakens its bargaining position. It also exposes a contradiction at the heart of Russia's strategy, demanding security guarantees while failing to secure its own operational rear. As the tempo of Ukrainian strikes increases, so too does the intensity of diplomatic maneuvering around the shape of a potential peace. The emergence of President Zelensky's 20-point peace plan, juxtaposed with Russia's claim that it is negotiating a separate 27-point framework with the United States, reveals a fractured diplomatic landscape in which peace itself has become a contested concept. These competing architectures are not merely different drafts of an agreement, they reflect fundamentally divergent visions of post-war order, security, and power in Eastern Europe. For Ukraine, the timing of the public release of the 20-point plan is as significant as its content. Coming amid demonstrable battlefield successes, particularly in the domain of unmanned warfare, the plan is designed to anchor diplomacy to the principle that aggression cannot be rewarded. Kyiv's insistence on sovereignty, security guarantees, and accountability is inseparable from its military posture. The implicit argument is clear: Ukraine is not asking for peace out of exhaustion, but from a position of resilience. By pairing diplomatic openness with kinetic pressure, Kyiv aims to prevent negotiations from drifting toward a conflict management outcome that would freeze Russian gains and institutionalize instability. Russia's response exposes its own strategic anxieties. By emphasizing that Zelensky's proposal radically differs from what Moscow has discussed with Washington, Russian officials are signaling a preference for great power bargaining that marginalizes Ukraine's agency. This reflects a long-standing structural feature of Russian foreign policy, the belief that durable security arrangements in Europe are ultimately negotiated over the heads of smaller states. Moscow's demands, restrictions on Ukraine's armed forces, decisions on sanctions relief, and access to frozen assets, suggest that it views peace less as a mutual settlement and more as a mechanism to consolidate strategic losses into manageable, reversible outcomes. The United States occupies a pivotal but increasingly complex position in this equation. Consultations in Miami and public statements about the possibility of ending the war within 90 days indicate a growing urgency in Washington to translate military support into diplomatic closure. Yet the unresolved territorial question underscores the limits of external mediation. For Ukraine, territorial integrity is existential; for Russia, territorial control is the primary tangible outcome of the war. This asymmetry makes compromise extraordinarily difficult and raises the risk that any hastily constructed agreement could prove unstable. The re-emergence of President Donald Trump as the Central American interlocutor adds another layer of uncertainty. His stated willingness to pressure both sides suggests a transactional approach in which leverage, rather than normative alignment, plays the decisive role. From Kyiv's perspective, this heightens the importance of maintaining battlefield momentum, as military effectiveness becomes a critical currency in persuading Washington that Ukraine's demands are realistic rather than maximalist. For Moscow, it opens the possibility that persistent pressure, military, economic, and political, could yield concessions without a full strategic reversal. European actors, meanwhile, appear as necessary but constrained participants. Their inclusion in calls and consultations reflects recognition that any peace arrangement will have direct consequences for European security. However, Europe's fragmented strategic voice limits its ability to shape outcomes independently. This creates a paradox: the war's resolution will define Europe's security architecture for decades, yet the decisive negotiations risk being dominated by Washington and Moscow. Looking beyond the immediate cycle of strikes and negotiations, the interaction between Ukraine's evolving military posture and the contested peace process points toward deeper, longer-term consequences for regional and global security. The war is no longer solely about territorial control in eastern and southern Ukraine; it has become a stress test for the durability of international norms, alliance structures, and the balance between military power and political legitimacy in the 21st century. At the structural level, Ukraine's reliance on unmanned systems highlights a broader transformation of warfare. By leveraging relatively affordable, adaptable technologies to offset Russia's advantages in manpower and heavy equipment, Kyiv has exposed a systemic vulnerability in traditional, platform-centric militaries. This has implications far beyond the battlefield. Regional powers observing the conflict are likely to draw lessons about the declining effectiveness of static air defenses, centralized command structures, and logistics networks exposed over long distances. In the long term, this diffusion of lessons could accelerate an arms race in autonomous and semi-autonomous systems, reshaping military doctrines from Eastern Europe to the Indo-Pacific. For Russia, the implications are more corrosive. Even if Moscow succeeds in extracting concessions through diplomacy, the war has revealed enduring weaknesses in its strategic model. The difficulty of defending occupied territories, the repeated loss of high-value assets, and the economic strain caused by sustained strikes on energy and industrial infrastructure point to a mismatch between Russia's geopolitical ambitions and its capacity to sustain them. This creates a risk of strategic overstretch that will persist regardless of any ceasefire. In the medium term, Russia may attempt to compensate by tightening internal control and deepening reliance on asymmetric tools, cyber operations, disinformation, and political interference abroad, further destabilizing its relations with the West. Ukraine's trajectory, by contrast, is defined by conditional resilience. Its ability to translate military effectiveness into political outcomes will depend on whether any eventual peace arrangement reinforces, rather than undermines, its sovereignty and security. A settlement that limits Ukraine's armed forces or leaves key territories unresolved could lock in long-term vulnerability, effectively postponing rather than resolving the conflict. Conversely, a framework that integrates Ukraine more deeply into Western security structures, even informally, would signal a decisive shift in the European balance of power, with lasting consequences for NATO, the EU, and Russia's role on the continent. Globally, the stakes extend even further. The way this war ends will shape perceptions of deterrence and credibility, particularly among states weighing revisionist ambitions. If sustained aggression yields territorial or political rewards, the precedent will resonate well beyond Europe. If, however, Ukraine's combination of military innovation and diplomatic persistence results in a settlement that upholds core principles of sovereignty, it could reinforce a fragile but still relevant international order.